What we are going to follow began in the was referred committee, which amendment, and which passed further amendments. In the House, it now had a similar history. Rules Committee passed by the House. It differed from the Senate bill. The House Conference Committee now worked out a compromise, which was passed Senate and House and to the President. Keep this chart in mind as we follow the story of the Housing Act of 1959.
In January of 1959, as I headed for Washington for the first session of the 86th Congress, my mind was on housing. I had long had an interest in housing and had fought for housing legislation. This year, I knew a housing bill would become law. I knew it because, well, the reason had to do with suburbia. The 1950s were a time of great suburban boom. Veterans legislation and federal housing legislation had a role in that boom. They made possible long-term, low costs with low down payments, which brought millions of people into the homeowner class, the boom in suburbia. But in 1959, the FHA loan authorization had been used up, and the demand was extended. Keep it going. Prospective homeowners, real estate people, and mortgage bankers were all saying, keep it going. I knew the Eisenhower administration was anxious to heed those demands, and we Democrats were too. In fact, many of us wanted to decrease down payments still further, and that was why I knew a housing bill would become law. The boom in suburbia would be continued. But I had other reasons for wanting a housing bill. I was especially concerned with the city, the slums. All over the United States, cities have been experiencing this creeping blight. Overcrowding, obsolescence. Housing experts have told us that a fifth of our homes are, by current standards, unfit for habitation. Over the decades, we are not gaining on this problem. Meanwhile, some people move out to the suburbs. Many who stay do so because they can't afford to move. As mayor of Philadelphia some years ago, I became deeply concerned with this problem. Later, in the Senate, for the Housing Subcommittee, I was among those who held hearings in various cities. And everywhere, I found the same problem. Near the heart of the city, cancerous slums. Around it, an area of decay. Finally, at the fringe, a fairly prosperous belt of suburbs. This belt was inhabited to a large extent by people who worked in the city, but most of them, for perfectly human reasons, were not inclined to think of the city's problem as their problem. But isn't it their problem? What is the cost to the nation as a whole of the spreading blight in the cities? Can this soil grow the kind of citizens we need? What is the cost of tensions, illness, hostility? Back in the 1930s, under the leadership of men like Senator Wagner, federal law had begun to recognize slum blight as a national problem, needing national solutions, including public housing. Before long, this view had the support not only of liberals, but of leading conservatives, men like Senator Robert Taft, who said this:
there didn't seem to me any alternative except to subsidize low-rent housing. And so I came to be a believer in that and one of the authors of the various bills which finally were enacted in the form of the 1949 Housing Act.
The Housing Act of 1949, the Wagner-Ellender-Taft bill. To my mind, it was a great turning point. It inaugurated the urban renewal program, under which the federal government became a partner in the job of clearing vast areas of slums so that private building could make a start. Of course, this had to be combined with public housing to house people displaced from slums. The Act of 49 provided for that too. And so in city after city, and clearing the land is reimbursed by the federal government. Senator Taft, co-author of that bill, was a candidate for the Republican nomination for president in 1952. Many looked on him as Mr. Republican, but he was considered too conservative, and General Eisenhower won the nomination and the election. In the following years, a number of federal programs were curtailed on grounds of economy. On this ground, a Democratic housing bill of 1958 was beaten in the House. But in the congressional elections that year, Democrats in all now, urban renewal and public housing, this time they would have their day. I had a talk with Senator Sparkman of Alabama, chairman of the subcommittee on housing. I wanted to know his plans.
Well, Joe, it seems that we must have an omnibus bill. That's obvious. If we have a public housing bill separately, it'll run into a veto. If we try to put through a good urban renewal program, he'll veto that. So I think the only thing for us to do is to wrap it up in one package along with the extension of the FHA authorization. The president wants that, wants it badly, and I don't believe he'll veto a bill that has that in it.
Yes, I agree with that, John. I think that's right.
Well, what I plan to do, Joe, is to introduce practically the same bill that passed the Senate last year, the omnibus bill. It was a very good bill, and I believe we can get it through without any difficulty, and I don't believe the president will veto it.
Well, I don't think he will either, but I'd hope we'd get something more in for urban renewal and public housing, and also for college housing loans. They're badly needed, too.
Well, so would I. And by the way, you recall that in last year's bill, we did have college housing, and certainly we'd take whatever fund was necessary to take care of the program. We could make a good bill out of it, and by stepping that up, if you want to public housing and increased urban renewal, why don't you introduce your own bill?
Well, if it's all right with you, I think that's what I'll do, because I don't think the present rate at urban renewal is nearly high enough to meet the need. So if it's all right with you, that's what I think I'll do.
Oh, certainly it's all right. Go ahead and do it, and we'll see what we can do with it.
Okay. A few days later, I introduced my bill in the Senate. A number of other housing bills were also introduced. Following the usual procedure, they were referred for consideration to the Banking and Currency Committee of the Senate. There, on January 22nd, hearings began under the chairmanship of Senator Sparkman as chairman of the Housing Subcommittee.
There's several bills that are before us. S-57, which I introduced, and Senator Fulbright has joined me in sponsoring. S-65 by Senator Capehart and others. S-193, 194, and 195 by Senator Clark and other co-sponsors.
The first witnesses, according to custom, represented the administration. They urged immediate extension of the FHA insurance authorization on a permanent basis. They recommended no appropriation for public housing. They asked a stopgap authorization for urban renewal, while urging that the federal government decrease its share in the program.
The American people can be improved only if their earnings and their savings are protected.
If the administration proposal goes through, isn't it perfectly clear that there will be less rather than more urban renewal, because some states and many cities will be forced out of the program because they can't afford it?
Senator Clark, of course, if more money is available to the American people will spend more on their housing. I can't argue on this score with you at all. I do say that when a city becomes imbued with the idea of wanting to clean up its slum conditions, and the citizens of that city want to clean up the slum conditions, then they will do a lot with some federal help and with their own initiative.
Isn't that wishful thinking? Isn't all you're doing to shift the tax burden from a progressive income tax system to a regressive sales and property tax system? I think when you do that, you're really doing a great injustice.
Well, Senator Clark, on the basis of our present knowledge, what we know now, of course, I can't argue with you on what you have to say. You are correct, of course. But this administration believes that the American public, given the opportunity, can come up with some of these answers that we are looking for, some of the answers to the problems of the slum areas of our cities.
But at the moment, Mr. Mason, the administration doesn't have any new ideas at all, does it?
I don't think we're at the point where we have to depend on the federal government for all our work to clear up urban blight in our cities. In fact, I know many cities that are doing this without federal funds, and so do all the members of this committee.
They were followed by a number of labor spokesmen, mayors, and others, who urged instead an expanded housing program, including college housing and non-dormitory building loans.
And fellow committee members, we need this legislation. We need it badly. we hope and urge that a bill at least equivalent to S-57, sufficient to meet our needs and those of many other municipalities across the nation, finds its way to the President's desk and that he signs this bill.
But these ideas brought occasional warnings from Republican members of our committee. For example, from Senator Bush.
Mr. Chairman, allow me to make a suggestion at this time. I think we're wasting our time discussing an omnibus bill of this size because it can never be signed into law. The President won't sign it. He'll veto this bill. I'd like to say once more right here before the committee that I don't like these omnibus bills. I think it's a poor way to legislate. Each of the titles in this bill are important enough to be considered on their own merit, and thus you give the President a chance to consider each issue so that he won't have to veto an entire bill in order to get rid of one very objectionable item. Most of our states now give the governors the power of item veto. It's time that the federal government did the same thing with the President of the United States.
In spite of the warning, our committee approved an omnibus bill. It included FHA extension, housing, urban renewal, and other matters, including a proposal of mine, a loan fund for college classroom building. Most Democratic members of the committee felt the bill would be passed by Congress and signed into law. Then, a few days later, we had a surprise.
The housing bill provides a much more expansive program than the budget does. For example, it has a very much expanded assistance to the to colleges, where we had about $200 million. They have 575. I don't believe that we should have higher taxes, and I do not believe that the United States wants higher taxes. That means to me living within your income by avoiding unnecessary expenditures. I stand on this, and you're going to hear me saying this often during the coming session. You'll probably get weary of it. But it's honest, and I think all of us should try to reason with ourselves, with our own minds, what it means if we just go into this reckless spending. Now
Despite the President's warning, the Senate on the following day passed the omnibus bill and even accepted an amendment of mine to increase the annual sums for urban renewal. Then it sent the bill to the House. The House referred the bill with other proposals to its Banking and Currency Committee. That committee finally approved the Senate bill with amendments of its own. Then the House Rules Committee, for almost 3 months, stalled action on the bill. Impatiently, we waited for the House to act. Finally, word came that the House had passed the bill. Because its version differed from the Senate version, a conference committee was appointed to reconcile the differences. This resulted in compromises which were to me a bitter disappointment. The urban renewal figures were scaled down. But some people said now it will be signed. The compromise bill was promptly passed by Senate and House and sent to the President. Again, we had a surprise. The President's veto message was referred to the Banking and Currency Committee. In an unusual move, hearings on the message were scheduled by the Housing Subcommittee.
These hearings are for the specific purpose of considering the President's veto message. Personally, I was shocked and bewildered by the tone and the substance of the President's message. The message characterizes the housing bill as extravagant, inflationary, discriminatory, and unnecessary. I emphatically deny that the housing bill can be accurately described by any of these extreme and intemperate catchwords.
Again, we heard a parade of witnesses.
current demands on the federal government, many of an emergency nature, the administration does not feel that any new public housing units should be authorized at this time.
It is inconceivable to me, in this, the richest nation in the world, that we cannot afford to eliminate our slums completely and to begin the job now. We mayors ask you to approve a program of $600 million a year for 10 years. Our surveys and our own direct knowledge and observation of the size of the problem in our cities indicates to us this full sum is required. In the light of the 1960 budget allocations, at least on the domestic level, our requests are not unreasonable. The resources of our nation are not so meager that we need put up with even one slum-dwelling unit. I urge you, Mr. Chairman, that we and all of us raise our sights.
The question was, should an attempt be made to override the veto? Could such a move succeed? Could a 2/3 vote be obtained? Could the doubtful votes be won? In midsummer, on July 31st, a rather desperate device was tried.
Let the committee come to order. Before calling today's witnesses, let me say that arrangements have been made for the subcommittee to hear a recording of what was probably the last major speech made by Senator Robert A. Taft, co-author of the Housing Act of 1949, and one who sincerely believed in the national policy of a decent home in a suitable living environment for every American family. Unfortunately, the years which have transpired since Senator Taft expressed those views have shown little evidence that this administration shares his views. I respectfully request that members of the committee and those in the hearing room be most attentive to his words.
I think we felt very clearly after those hearings that it was a field in which private industry, no matter what they said, could not successfully operate. You finally get down to the point where people have so little money to pay that the money they pay their landlords can't even keep up those houses in repair. There didn't seem to me any alternative except to subsidize low-rent housing. And so I came to be a believer in that and one of the authors of the various bills which finally were enacted in the form of the 1949 Housing Act.
On August 12th, after some indecision, the Senate committee decided to recommend overriding the president's veto. In the Senate, the attempt failed by 9 votes. So the bill was scaled down further to meet some of the president's objections. The revised bill was passed by Senate and House and once more sent to the White House. Again, the president used his veto. The president now urged Congress to abandon the omnibus bill idea and instead to enact a separate FHA extension without delay. We stuck to the omnibus bill. This time, in the last week of the session, our committee removed the appropriation for college classroom building loans and made a few other changes. Again, Senate and House passed the bill. This time, the president signed it. So a housing bill was passed. It wasn't what I wanted. It had some public housing and some funds for urban renewal. Not what I had hoped for. Still, it was worth having. But the new FHA authorization had a ceiling on it. That meant that in about a year, when this amount was used up, there would have to be another housing bill for the sake of suburbia. So we would be able to try again with another omnibus bill. In the spring of 1960, hearings began on various new bills. Now we could start again for urban renewal, public housing, college housing.
For the purpose of considering legislation for a 1960 Housing Act. There are a great number of bills that have been introduced. We intend to hold hearings on all of them and to consider them in the course of these hearings. The bills now before us include S467, S914, S1342, S1680, S195.
The legislative process has no beginning and no end. It originates in the needs and desires of the American people, expressed through elected officials and interest groups. It is a process with many steps, requiring carefully planned strategy. The process involves clashes and compromise between President and Congress, between political parties, among factions within the parties, and among private interest groups. But dissatisfaction with compromise leads to new attempts, and the process goes on.